We sold the house 3 days after my father died. Not because we needed the money. Not because anyone was rushing us. But because the house no longer felt neutral. It had weight. The kind of weight you don't notice until it's gone, like pressure in your ears when an elevator stops too fast. The rooms were the same size they had always been, but they felt compressed, as if the walls had leaned in slightly during the night and never moved back. I noticed it first in the hallway. The air there was colder. Not dramatically. Just enough that your skin reacted before your thoughts did. The floor creaked in places that had never creaked before. Or maybe they always had, and I was only now listening. The house didn't smell like death. It smelled like dust and old fabric and something faintly electrical, warm plastic, metal that had been powered for too long. The buyers didn't notice any of this. They walked through the house with polite interest, nodding at the right moments, asking about square footage, insulation, the age of the roof. They tapped walls with their knuckles, smiling when the sound was solid. They never tapped the wrong one. My father had lived in that house for 32 years. He bought it young, before he learned how fragile plans were. Back when his voice carried across rooms without effort. Back when he laughed with his mouth open and his head tilted back, like he trusted the air to hold him up. When I was a child, he filled space. Not loudly. Not aggressively. He just existed with confidence. He had habits that made him feel permanent. The way he stood in doorways instead of walking through them. The way he paused before answering questions, as if every response deserved a moment of consideration. The way he whistled, not songs, just tones, while fixing things around the house. Then, slowly, he began to reduce himself. At first it was practical. He stopped hosting gatherings. Stopped inviting people over. He said the house was too much work now. That he preferred quiet. That noise gave him headaches. Then he started closing doors. Rooms we used every day were suddenly off limits. The basement. The back hallway. The spare bedroom that had never held anything important. He installed locks where none had existed before. When I asked him why, he didn't look at me. Drafts, he said. Old houses have drafts. The wall appeared around that time. I don't remember it being built. I don't remember construction sounds or dust or disruption. It was just, there. At the end of the back hallway, where the house should have continued for another few feet, there was now a flat beige surface. Same paint. Same texture. Same imperfections. Except it was wrong. The hallway felt shorter. The proportions didn't align with memory. And the wall was colder than the others. Not damp. Not damaged. Just indifferent. If you leaned your shoulder against it, there was no give. No echo. No vibration from footsteps on the other side. It absorbed sound. I asked him about it once. I was standing near the kitchen sink, watching water pool briefly before sliding down the drain. He was at the table, reading something, not a book, not a newspaper. Just loose pages. What's behind that wall? I asked. He didn't turn the page. Insulation, he said. The word landed flat. Not defensive. Not irritated. Final. Don't touch it. At night, I heard him walking. Not pacing. Not wandering. Walking with intention. Always the same rhythm. Always the same pause. His steps would stop near the back hallway, just long enough for silence to feel deliberate, and then continue, softer this time, as if he had shifted direction. I never heard a door open. I never heard a door close. Only absence. Years passed. I grew up. Moved out. Returned only for holidays. The house didn't age the way other houses do. Nothing was upgraded. Nothing was replaced unless it failed completely. When paint cracked, he painted over it with the same color. When a cabinet hinge broke, he fixed the hinge, not the cabinet. He preserved surfaces, not appearances. And my father grew smaller. Not physically at first. Internally. His voice lost projection. His posture collapsed inward. His sentences shortened. He began to lock the back hallway at night. He stopped using it altogether in his final year. Dust settled there undisturbed. A light bulb burned out and was never replaced. Thin cobwebs formed in the upper corners, careful, precise, untouched. But the breaker panel near that hallway was always clean. No dust. No grime. No signs of neglect. Like someone touched it regularly. When he died, the house felt empty in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not quiet. Empty. As if something essential had left before his body did. We found no note. No explanation. No last words. Just keys. Too many keys. Some went nowhere. Some fit locks that no longer existed. One didn't match anything I recognized. It was small. Old. Its teeth uneven with wear. I found where it belonged by accident. Or maybe I didn't. It was taped behind the breaker panel, wrapped in old electrical tape that left residue on my fingers when I peeled it away. The metal behind it was slightly warmer than the rest, like it had recently been touched. The key was heavier than it looked. I held it longer than necessary. The buyers arrived later that day. They smiled. They nodded. They spoke about plans. They never noticed me standing near the back hallway. Never noticed my hand in my pocket. Never noticed the wall. That night, alone in the house, I stood in front of it. Up close, the paint imperfections told a different story. Brush strokes were tighter. More controlled. Like someone had worked carefully, not casually. I pressed my palm against it. Nothing. I knocked once. The sound didn't travel. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Then I found the seam. A vertical line, thinner than a credit card, hidden in the shadow where the wall met the floor molding. The key fit. Perfectly. I didn't open it right away. I sat on the floor. Listened to the house settle. Counted my breathing. Because whatever was behind that wall had waited longer than I had been alive. And I understood, suddenly, that opening it would end something. I turned the key slowly. Not because I was afraid it would break. But because I needed time to feel the moment pass. There was no click. No mechanical confirmation. Just a soft release, like tension letting go. The wall didn't swing open. It didn't slide dramatically. It shifted inward by a few centimeters and stopped. Enough to prove that it wasn't a wall at all. I pressed my shoulder against it, gently at first, then with more weight. The surface moved with controlled resistance, like it had been designed to stop people from pushing too hard too fast. The opening widened just enough for a thin line of darkness to appear. Not black. Depthless. The kind of dark that absorbs whatever you try to project into it. Cold air came out. Not stale. Not damp. Cold in a deliberate way, as if the temperature had been preserved. I stood there longer than I should have. I remember noticing how quiet the house was. No refrigerator hum. No pipes. No distant traffic. It felt staged. Artificially silent. Like the house itself was waiting for something to resume. When I finally stepped inside, the first thing I felt was how wrong the proportions were. The room was longer than it should have been. Narrower than it had any right to be. The ceiling was low, low enough that I had to angle my head slightly to avoid brushing it. The walls were unfinished concrete, smooth in some places, raw in others. The floor wasn't concrete at all. It was wood. Old. Reinforced. Treated. Someone had planned for weight. There was one light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was already on. I didn't remember flipping any switches. The bulb didn't flicker. Didn't buzz. It cast a yellow light that made everything look older than it was. The smell hit next. Paper. Metal. And something faintly organic, not rot, not mold, more like old leather, or skin that had been exposed to air for too long. The walls weren't empty. Shelves ran along both sides, evenly spaced, measured with care. Cardboard boxes filled most of them. All labeled in my father's handwriting. Dates. Initials. Short phrases that meant nothing to me. Not sentimental labels. Operational ones. On the far end of the room was a table. Steel legs. Scratched surface. Bolted to the floor. On it were stacks of paper held together with binder clips, weighed down with flat metal bars like the kind used in workshops. A small safe sat underneath, flush against the wall, its keypad dark. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there. And for the first time since he died, I felt something close to presence. Not comfort. Presence. Like the room was still occupied in a way the rest of the house wasn't. I don't know how long I stayed in that doorway. Time didn't behave normally there. Eventually, I stepped fully inside, and the wall moved back behind me with a soft, final sound. Not a slam. Not a lock. A seal. The light remained on. I remember thinking, briefly, that this meant he'd expected someone to come in eventually. That he'd designed the room not to hide forever, but to wait. The first box I opened was the lightest. Inside were folders. Each one a different color. No particular order that I could see. The paper inside was dense with text, annotations in the margins, dates circled, lines crossed out. Names appeared again and again. Some were printed. Some handwritten. Some crossed out. I recognized one immediately. A man who had once been my father's business partner. I remembered him clearly. His laugh. His expensive watch. The way he used my father's first name too casually, like ownership. The folder contained contracts. Emails. Bank statements. All copied. All organized. And then, at the back, a photograph. Burned at the edges. Not enough to destroy it. Enough to mark it. The second box was heavier. Cash. Old bills. New bills. Foreign currency. Not loose. Bundled. Catalogued. Each stack wrapped with paper strips labeled with dates. There were years missing. Large gaps. Like accumulation had been paused, and then resumed. The third box contained objects. Small things. A watch. A USB drive. A set of keys that weren't house keys. And a phone. Old. No SIM card. Battery removed. I sat down on the floor. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I needed to lower myself into the reality of what I was seeing. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't obsession. This was infrastructure. My father hadn't been hiding. He'd been building. Quietly. Patiently. Over decades. I started to understand why he had shrunk in the rest of the house. All of him had gone here. The silence. The restraint. The locked doors. He hadn't been withdrawing. He'd been reallocating. The names on the folders weren't random. Once I started recognizing a few, the pattern became unavoidable. People who had sued him. People who had testified against him. People who had smiled while doing it. Every folder told the same story from a different angle. Timelines overlapped. Events connected. Small decisions cascaded into large consequences. I found my father's handwriting in the margins. Not angry. Not emotional. Observational. Contradiction. False statement. Pressure point. Words like tools. There were no plans outlined. No manifestos. No declarations of intent. Just preparation. And then I noticed something else. Some folders ended abruptly. No conclusion. No summary. Just, stopped. And those were the ones with burn marks. Not always on the photos. Sometimes on the paper itself. Singed corners. Heat-warped edges. Like the end of the story had required something irreversible. At the far end of the room, behind the table, was a narrow cabinet I hadn't noticed at first. It blended into the concrete too well. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them. All identical. No dates on the covers. I opened one at random. The first page was blank. The second had a single line. He thinks I've forgotten. The handwriting was steady. The next page. He believes time protects him. Then, several blank pages. Then. Waiting is not passive. I closed the notebook. Not because I was scared. But because I felt something shift. A subtle realignment of memory. Moments from my childhood resurfaced, things I had dismissed at the time. Long phone calls. Sudden trips. The way he'd listen more than he spoke when certain names came up. He hadn't been silent. He'd been collecting. I don't know when I noticed the smell of smoke. It wasn't fresh. It was old. Embedded. Like a memory trapped in the walls. Near the back of the room was a metal container. Inside were ashes. Not loose. Compressed. Carefully separated into smaller sealed bags. Each bag had a label. A name. One of them was crossed out. Thick black marker. Not fire. Marker. That was when I understood the difference. Some names ended in preparation. Some ended in action. And some ended differently. I left the room before dawn. I didn't close it completely. Just enough to restore the illusion. When the buyers came the next morning, I walked them through the house one last time. They talked about renovations. About opening the space. About tearing down walls. I nodded. Smiled. Said nothing. Because I now knew something they didn't. The house didn't contain the room. The room had contained my father. And now it contained me. I didn't go back to the room the next day. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find. But because I needed to see what it felt like to exist outside of it again. Morning light moved through the house in the same way it always had. Dust particles floated lazily where sunbeams cut through the air. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. The refrigerator hummed, then stopped, then hummed again. Ordinary sounds. They felt artificial now. Like background noise added after the important part had already happened. I poured coffee and didn't drink it. I stood at the sink and watched steam rise and disappear. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from excess awareness. Every sensation arrived fully formed, without filtering. I realized then that the room hadn't shocked me. It had clarified me. There was a difference. Shock overwhelms. Clarity reorganizes. By noon, I noticed something else. My father's name no longer felt complete on its own. Every time I thought of him, my mind automatically attached context, connections, trajectories, consequences. His quiet years no longer looked empty. They looked dense. Compressed. I remembered the way he used to sit at the table in the evenings, papers spread out in front of him, not reading, just arranging them. Moving them into piles. Separating. Recombining. I had thought he was lost. He had been sorting. I returned to the room in the afternoon. The light bulb was still on. Unchanged. Uninterrupted. As if time hadn't passed there at all. This time, I walked straight to the notebooks. I didn't flip randomly anymore. I started from the first one. The early entries were sparse. Observations. Recollections. Names written once and never repeated. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Not emotionally, structurally. Sentences became shorter. More precise. The gaps between entries grew larger. Pages were left blank intentionally, not from lack of content but from restraint. I realized the notebooks weren't diaries. They were staging areas. Thoughts that weren't ready to be used yet. Some entries repeated across multiple notebooks, rewritten with small variations. Slightly different phrasing. Adjusted emphasis. He wasn't recording his thoughts. He was refining them. One name appeared more often than the others. It belonged to someone I had never met. But I knew his impact intimately. A man whose decision, years earlier, had dismantled my father's career without touching him directly. A man who had never raised his voice, never made a threat, never done anything overtly wrong. Just aligned incentives in the right direction. The folder associated with that name was thicker than the rest. Not because it contained more documents. But because it contained layers. Evidence of evidence. Contradictions cross-referenced against other contradictions. My father hadn't been trying to destroy him. He'd been trying to understand him completely. There was a difference. The safe under the table took longer. I entered combinations instinctively, based on patterns I'd already noticed in the room, dates that recurred, numbers tied to specific events. It opened on the third attempt. Inside were digital backups. Hard drives. Encrypted flash devices. A single envelope. The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photograph. The photograph was recent. Much more recent than I expected. It showed the man from the thick folder, older now, standing outside a building I recognized. A building I passed regularly. The paper contained one sentence. He believes I stopped watching. That was when the room stopped feeling historical. This wasn't a record of something that had happened. It was a system that had been paused. Waiting for an operator. I thought, briefly, that my role might simply be custodial. That I was meant to close the room. Preserve it. Let it remain a monument to something unfinished. That thought lasted less than a minute. Because the room didn't feel archival. It felt active. Everything inside it had been arranged with continuity in mind. Cross-references assumed future input. Blank pages weren't mistakes, they were reserved. My father hadn't been preparing for closure. He had been preparing for transfer. The next few days blurred together. The house emptied. Furniture was moved. Documents were signed. I watched strangers measure walls, discuss demolition, talk casually about opening up the space. I nodded at the right moments. I said nothing when they joked about tearing the place apart. Because I knew what they didn't. You can remove walls. You can't remove alignment. On the last night before the sale finalized, I went back one final time. Not to the room. To my father's bedroom. It was exactly as he'd left it. The bed neatly made. The closet sparse. No personal clutter. I noticed something I'd missed before. A notebook on the nightstand. Not like the others. Smaller. Worn. Inside were no observations. No names. No plans. Just one sentence, written on the first page. If you're reading this, it means you saw what I couldn't finish. Nothing else. No instructions. No warning. I slept poorly that night. Not from fear. From responsibility. After the house sold, I didn't feel relief. I felt continuity. The room didn't belong to the house. The house had only been a shell. I moved what mattered quietly, carefully, over several weeks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing noticeable. Just enough to preserve structure. The room reassembled itself elsewhere. Different walls. Same logic. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I hadn't opened it. If I had sealed the wall permanently. Let the house be torn down. Let the past collapse into debris. But I know that wouldn't have ended anything. It would have only delayed it. Because systems like that don't disappear. They wait. I still think about the names. Some are crossed out now. Not by fire. Not by marker. By absence. They no longer require attention. Others remain. Unfinished. Active. I don't feel anger toward them. Anger wastes precision. I feel something closer to calibration. My father used to say very little near the end. But there was one phrase I remember clearly. He said it once, quietly, without context. Most people mistake silence for surrender. At the time, I thought he was talking about himself. Now I understand. He was talking about timing. I don't talk about the room. Not because I'm hiding it. But because language reduces things like that. It turns systems into stories, and stories into opinions. What was built there doesn't survive explanation. It survives attention. Over time, I stopped thinking of it as my father's work. That distinction mattered at first. It gave me distance. It allowed me to pretend I was only dealing with an inheritance, something static, finished, belonging to the past. But inheritances don't change shape when you look at them. This did. The more time passed, the more I noticed how often the world offered confirmations. Small ones. Quiet ones. A name appearing in an article. A company dissolving without explanation. A sudden relocation. A sentence that didn't quite add up if you read it carefully. Patterns don't announce themselves. They wait to be recognized. I never added new names lightly. In fact, I resisted it longer than I expected. There was comfort in maintenance. In preservation. In pretending that my role was limited to safeguarding what already existed. That restraint felt like respect. But restraint without honesty is just fear with better posture. Eventually, I accepted what my father already had. The room was never about revenge. Revenge is loud. Reactive. Short-sighted. This was about balance. Correction. He had never wanted to punish people for what they did to him. He had wanted to ensure that their actions reached a natural conclusion. That trajectories weren't allowed to extend infinitely just because no one bothered to observe them closely. That silence didn't become immunity. I learned to move slowly. Not because speed was dangerous. But because speed reveals intent. I learned to listen without responding. To collect without reacting. To let people assume they were being overlooked. Most people are reckless when they think no one is paying attention. They become efficient in their dishonesty. Comfortable in their shortcuts. Predictable. There are moments when I think about stopping. Not ending it. Just stepping back. Letting the remaining threads resolve themselves however they will. But those thoughts never last. Because I understand now what happens when systems are abandoned mid-process. Someone else takes over. Less patient. Less precise. Less restrained. My father had understood that too. That's why he never rushed. That's why he never explained. Explanation invites negotiation. Observation doesn't. Sometimes I revisit the notebooks. Not to relive them, but to remember the discipline they represent. Most pages are still blank. They're meant to stay that way. Blank space isn't absence. It's capacity. People occasionally ask me about my father. What he was like near the end. I tell them the truth, as far as it goes. That he became quiet. That he kept to himself. That he didn't leave many words behind. They usually interpret that as sadness. Or defeat. I let them. Because people need narratives they can carry without discomfort. The truth is simpler. He wasn't finished. And neither am I. The last time I stood inside the room. The real one, before it was dismantled and reassembled elsewhere. I noticed something I hadn't before. The light bulb. It wasn't wired to the house at all. It had its own source. Independent. Redundant. Prepared for outages. It had never flickered. Not once. When I turned it off for the final time. The darkness didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Some things don't end. They just change hands. And some rooms are never meant to be found. Only continued.